Hi there and welcome back to Like Maria. Today I'm going to concentrate on GCSE poetry, mainly from the AQA specification, but some of these poems are on other specs and you'll be able to listen and think about the comparative elements even if you don't have the poem on your specification. You can treat it as an unseen, for example. So I'm going to talk about Jane Weir and her poem Poppies, and then Simon Armitage and his poem Remains. So after today, you'll be able to do a comparison of these poems, just like Maria. Please like and subscribe. So I'm actually going to answer an essay question with you. I'm going to work through that. The essay question is: compare how poets present the emotional effects of conflict on individuals in Poppies and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. And I've chosen Remains by Simon Armitage. I'm going to have in front of me my GCSE Anthology so that I can really deep dive and reference carefully. So let's get cracking. Starting with an introduction, which is my overall thesis about these two poems and how they might work together, focusing in on the emotional effects of conflict. My introduction would be: both poems demonstrate the wide-reaching emotional effects of conflict, but Poppies deals with gentle remembrance, whereas Remains deals with the persistent horror being relived here and now. So for me, Poppies is very much a gentle remembrance of her son, the character in the poem, and reflecting on her son. She is navigating through a domestic setting and she has gentle remembrance, perhaps regrets, perhaps some guilt, and there's certainly evidence of war coming into that, but it's very much in a domestic setting. Whereas Armitage's poem is full on brutality of war, very vivid. So we're going to look at 4 areas where I think this is really well demonstrated. First of all, we're going to look at the voices in the poem. Then we're going to have a quick rummage through the structure and see what could be taken from there. Then we're going to look at the actual idea of remains and things remaining in one's memory. And last but not least, we're going to talk about guilt and the control of guilt. So first of all, let's talk about the voices in the poem. In the Jane Weir, in Poppies, we have a monologue here with an implied listener, the son. So here really it's kind of a dramatic monologue and has many similarities to our Browning, My Last Duchess, because we are earwigging on a conversation. The speaker uses I, first person pronoun, you, second person pronoun. She speaks in the past tense, and there is no rhyme or rhythm here, certainly not a strict rhyme structure or a strict meter. So we can say that this is in free verse and that this enhances the intimacy and the nature of the conversation that she is having with the son. So the intimate and spontaneous nature of conversation that she is having with her son. On the other hand, Simon Armitage's poem is much more direct. It's in the present tense, which makes it very vivid and apparent to us. He uses we and I, so it is a monologue. It is addressing us in the first person. But the reader is the audience here. There's a very direct link between the voice of the soldier and the audience here. We get very many vivid details about the firing of the guns and how the looter was killed with 3 of a kind all letting fly. I see every round as it rips through his life. So there's some really graphic, unpleasant details surrounding the killing here, which really makes this a poem about bloodshed and the cruelty of war. So really important to distinguish between the voices and how the reader experiences the voice there. Second section is about the structure of the poems. Now this is always a tricky one to find out and to look at, particularly if you're dealing with an unseen. Here I would suggest with Poppies the structure is based around a domestic setting and the wandering of the mind of the mother in this setting. She's going back and forth to memories. She's conflating two memories, perhaps one of sending the boy on his first day to school and the other sending the son on his first day off going to be a soldier. So there are moments where she goes into the bedroom, where she leaves the house and goes up to the graveyard and sees the war memorial. So I would express the structure of this poem as a journey through memories and places. There is a very specific memory, of course, a very particular memory that she has of sending the boy out the door, and that is kind of the hub of the poem here. Now, with the Armitage, it's a little bit different. We have still relatively free verse. However, it is broken down and organised into stanzas. We have 4 initial stanzas that tell us about the anecdote of the experience of the soldier and his colleagues killing the looter. So that's the first bit, about the experience and the express detail of the killing. The second 4 stanzas, which structurally kind of swivel round line 17 really, end of story, except not really. That is where the poem changes. And then we get the soldier recounting the psychological trauma that he has, the effects of the killing on his life and his mind. And here we get symptoms of PTSD, of the killing being relived and remembered constantly in his head. So structure of the second poem, Remains, is very much more decided, if you like, by the poet, very much more curated by the poet. There's a before and there's an after. It's clear that this event affected me in this way. The next thing I want to talk about is the title of the poem itself, Remains, and the idea that in both poems there are remains of people that have been lost in memories. And this is, I think, a connection here. So in Poppies, we have the son remaining in the mother's memory. And as her journey goes round the house, in her mind, through memories, he remains very much there in a very sensual way. She's touching bits of fabric. She remembers wanting to graze his nose. She remembers the feeling of letting him go. So as she journeys through moments and places in her mind, she hasn't lost him. He remains there with her. But also, I think very poignant here is we never find out as a reader, as a listener, what exactly happened to the son. We don't know whether he was missing in action or whether he was killed. We assume, of course, that he was, and that's created this poem. But she is very careful not to tell us expressly what remains there are, particularly whether his grave is actually in the graveyard, whether his name is on the memorial. And it seems that the boy's remains, the soldier's remains in Poppies, is much more generally respected in society through the Poppies, through the war memorial, and is very private to his mother. So we don't get the full story in Poppies. It's somehow suppressed there. And this may be her lack of ability to deal with the full story and the actual remains that can't be addressed. In Armitage's poem, which is actually entitled Remains, what remains for him is the guilt. He can't get rid of the guilt. There is no grave. He's not got that sort of remains either. No body remains, but it does remain with him. The memory remains with him. The guilt remains with him. It invades every part of his life. It invades his dreams. So we could say that for Armitage, the remains are what he carries with him in his head, but he has not put any remains to rest. And partly for Armitage in this poem, I think we can interpret remains as what remains of the soldier himself, and that what is left of the soldier and what remains is not the soldier before he had this traumatic experience. So I think that idea of remains, what remains after conflict, what remains psychologically in memory and affects emotionally, is really important here. Lastly, I wanted to talk specifically about guilt in these two poems. For me, Poppies has a touch of guilt. The conflating of the two images about sending the boy to war and sending him to school as a child with his blazer on are really key here. Often mothers feel guilt and worry and a sense that they can't protect their child anymore when they're sent off to school for the first day. The same feeling is repeated in her when she sends the boy off as a soldier. And now, reflecting back on that, there's a little hint that the dangers were lying out there in words such as reinforcements and greys. There is a hint that she knew what was coming and that she was unable to protect her son. Early on, she would wander over to the playground and strain to hear the voice. Now she's not able to do that. She's yearning to have him back. Now, this isn't expressly explained in the poem, but there is a sense here that there is gentle guilt, there is a remembrance, there is beauty, much beauty in this poem and beautiful imagery, but somehow that the mother isn't able to express the pain that she really deep down feels in the way that she wasn't able to express the worry over her child when she sent him off. She had to be brave. In contrast, the soldier has immediate psychological effects. He does not have the luxury of being able to have gentle memory. There is an outside force that pushes on him. He talks about how even in his dreams, the looter bursts through the door. And that verb, that dynamic verb bursts, really tells us that he's not able to control memories. He talks of his bloody hands, rather like Macbeth. The guilt is there. The blood is on his hands. He is haunted by the ghost of the soldier. He cannot control his mind and his memories. Sleep is disturbed. Even drugs and drink will not obliterate that memory. They don't help. So he is very much being acted on by a guilt that he can't control and he is distressed by. And at the very end of that poem, he talks about the here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. And the idea that he wasn't very sure whether or not the boy was armed. Probably armed, possibly not. He's reflecting on that emotional impact of being the one to decide over life and death. And of course, this is very different from the mother in Poppies. To a certain extent, she sent the soldier off. She didn't express her thoughts, her worries. She was brave, but she let him go. But in Armitage's poem, there was this real pain at being the person who pulled the trigger, who had control over the life and death of another person. And this problematic situation, which he acted on in the split second, has caused him long-standing psychological distress. So here we have two quite different poems, but they're both dealing with something that is problematic for them in terms of remembrance. I've written a conclusion for you, which I'll pop up on a slide, and you'll be able to just have a look at how I've tied those ideas together. So I hope you found that useful. Please remember to ping the like button and subscribe, and join me again for some more GCSE poetry, and in particular those comparisons. See you next time.